Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. How may the jobs and the workforce in the future change quite dramatically? What is one United Nations agency, namely the International Labor Organization, doing to help us adapt to these changes? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. It seems as though daily we're reading about how jobs and future workforces are changing, not only today, but will certainly in the future. My guest today is someone who's very familiar with this issue and is going to bring us up to date on some very important information and approaches to dealing with these. My guest today is Mr. Kevin Cassidy. Kevin Cassidy is the Senior Economic and Social Development and External Relations Officer in the International Labor Organization Office for the United Nations. Kevin Cassidy, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you very much, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me. Kevin, we're going to get into the workforce because we all have an interest in it. We're either in it or have been or will be, whichever the case may be. But let's talk about the International Labor Organization, the ILO. Very briefly, when was it formed? Why was it formed? What does it do?
Right. The International Labor Organization was born alongside the League of Nations in the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I. It was the injustices that people had seen in the world of work. It was the loss of lives that we had seen through this massive war, this mechanized war. So people were learning out of the Industrial Revolution that in order to have peace, you had to actually have access to social justice. So if you look at the constitutions of both the League of Nations, which then became the UN, and the ILO, we are sister organizations in the sense that one deals with peace and security, but in order to have peace and security, people must be treated fairly, and for our work, it's in the workplace.
Now, the ILO is, I think, the only United Nations agency, what we call a tripartite arrangement. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, it's an interesting construction. I mean, most of the UN agencies today deal with governments. They are the seat of power. They define populations, they represent their citizens. But also in the world of work, you have to look at the real actors of the economy. And there you're looking at employers and workers' organizations. So the ILO decided that it was, in 1919, that it was advantageous to have both employer, worker, and the government sit down at the table together to discuss the issues that were of importance. How are we going to make money? How is the profitability going to be split between the various actors? How are we going to look at productivity issues? Where were the areas in which we're going to grow? How are we going to set standards in the world and at that time when there were no standards? So the ILO, in addition to being a tripartite organization, also is a normative agency. So, for example, the first convention of the ILO, which has the weight of international law, was hours of work, because prior to that, during the Industrial Revolution, people worked until they dropped. So many of the people watching today can thank the ILO for their weekends.
Very good. We all appreciate our weekends. And it's very important, as you mentioned, that you have the government, you have the workers, and you also have the business community involved in this, the employers. And you have to have a buy-in from all three if any agreement is going to be successful and they're not pitting against one another at odds. So it's critical to bring them all to the table. Now, if our viewers go to www.ilo.org, they can look at your website and they'll find on there your 4 pillars. What exactly are the 4 pillars of the ILO?
Right. So when we speak about the 4 pillars, we're talking about how do we describe decent work. And decent work is about the aspirations of people in the world today. You know, people are not commodities. They're not wood. They're not steel. You don't put them into a machine and they come out at the other end as something else. You know, people have families, they have dreams, they have ambitions for themselves. So in order to look after the issues of the rights at work, we've constructed this concept called decent work. Now, decent work has been around now since the Social Development Summit in Copenhagen in 1995. But before that, there was a belief that the word decency meant something. So for the ILO, there are 4 pillars for decent work. The first are international standards and norm. Hours of work, conditions of work, maternity leave, paternity leave, maritime labor conventions. So it sets the standard in the world of work, again, negotiated by the three partners, the workers, employers, and governments. So you have to have international standards to measure how people in the world of work are faring today. The second pillar is employment creation, sustainable enterprises. The ILO believes, of course, that if there aren't employers to invest, there are no jobs. And if there are no workers to apply their trade and their talent, then there are no going enterprises. So the sustainability of the enterprise and job creation is very, very important, and those are intimately linked. The third pillar of that is social dialogue. And social dialogue basically means that people in the workplace have the opportunity to speak and raise concerns. Now, it's not just complaining about poor conditions or bad remuneration and so, but it's also saying, here I am, a worker on the line manufacturing a tire or putting together a computer, and I have a chance to contribute to that and say, well, if we change this, we would save time, we would save money, we'd increase profitability, we'd lower our defect rates, and hence everyone wins on that. So it's important to have dialogue so that before a situation becomes out of control, where you have a festering problem or you have complaints that productivity is low, then the worker themselves can contribute in a equal dialogue with the management of that operation. And the fourth pillar is called social protection. Now, social protection is a concept that goes from cradle to grave. So, for example, you have a young mother who has 3 or 4 children. The family is quite poor. They're living below the poverty line. Do we allow them to fall to their own devices, to have the kids go out and work instead of going to school? No. So governments, like in Brazil, will have a conditional cash transfer, which transfers money to the poor families. And the obligation on the family is to make sure the kids are going to school, because an illiterate, innumerate child will grow up to be an illiterate, innumerate adult who doesn't have an opportunity to compete in today's society. So by investing, and this is an investment, it's not just a cost, it is an investment in the society itself, so that those young children can grow up to be teachers and doctors and lawyers and engineers, so they can contribute more fully to society. That's at the one end of the spectrum. Then you have also unemployment insurance. So for anyone who may have lost a job, they have to apply for insurance, and that gets them over the rough transition period of looking for a new job, because if somebody loses their income, they need some way to buy food, pay the rent, pay the electrical bill. It doesn't help the society or the government itself by putting people into poverty. So by providing this little extension, it helps them get over the rough period. Social protection is also about reskilling and retraining. These are active labor market policies that, for example, when new technology is introduced into a particular sector and there is less of a need for people to work on the line, you need to skill people for new jobs or to upskill people so that they can actually run the machines that are, the automation of car manufacturing or with computers and so. And then at the tail end of that, we look at, and we call it here in the United States, Social Security, but it's called social protection and income in your old age, so that when you have done a lifetime of work and you have contributed through your taxes to the government for working in the formal economy, and that's another big issue we have between informal and formal, which half of the world is split on the two in the working world, that you want to know that in your retirement that you have some income that allows you to buy food and to have lodging and to live a life that you have worked hard for all of your life.
Mm-hmm. And all 4 of those are extremely important. The one on social protection, though, is one that gets a lot of discussion, especially in the United States and many other areas around the world. As governments have moved into the period of austerity, or periods of austerity, a lot of politicians, a lot of programmers, whatever, are talking about reducing unemployment insurance benefits, raising the age of Social Security. In order to retire, you'd have to be up 70, 72, 74, whatever the case might be. Taking away some of these, really the safety net, and as you mentioned, these are investments in people. These programs are bridges, or what people have earned by working their life and contributing to these particular programs. But these are extremely important, and we really need to be careful when we start talking about dismantling or even weakening these programs. Should we? I think we need to look at them all critically, but still we just don't want to take a machete to the programs and undermine people. And by investing in these people, they help to raise their potential, and they also are contributing members of the society, and they pay taxes, and they buy homes and cars and refrigerators and that type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, social protection is very misunderstood. I think people see these as just costs, as I mentioned, and as you've indicated as well. These are investments in people. This is investment in your human capital, because in any country, the most valuable natural resource you have are the citizens, educated citizenry, who can actually go out and command higher level jobs with higher level pay. To start cutting away as looking at these as just costs sort of misses the point. Is that if you allow people to fall below poverty line and they see no incentive to go and create new skills for themselves or to learn new skills for themselves, they're not going to be able to contribute fully to society. They may wind up in informal economy where no taxes are being paid to the government. You have to sort of look at the long-term issue on this. So when they start with the austerity measures or fiscal consolidation, and so we have seen that actually by lowering protection for workers actually doesn't generate employment. So these are not techniques that are very sound in their economics. So what we encourage governments to do is to create a space for at least the social protection floor. These are the minimums in health, education, and in income. And when you provide that to your citizenry, then you realize that people are starting to move forward together. And it is a concerted effort on the country. Now, it's very difficult for many countries to find the fiscal space to do so, hence is why they're chipping away at the budgets on that. But all you have to do is look around you and you see the impacts of reducing social services or protection for people with mental handicaps and so. So you have to look at social protection as that investment is bringing all of society forward and not excluding any group or particular ethnic minority in that society.
Now, we think back to 2000 in the United Nations, the majority of the countries of the General Assembly adopted the UN Millennium Development Goals to reduce abject poverty by 50%, to promote universal primary school education, to empower women, and 5 others I won't go into. And now they're expiring December 31st, 2015, so to speak. And then you will have the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of these goals that will be adopted by all the countries, all 193 countries in the UN General Assembly. We can't go through all 17, but what's the thrust of the Sustainable Development Goals over a 15-year period, and which ones, I know they're all important, but which ones do you tie into with the ILO?
Yeah, the Sustainable Development Goals are the sort of natural inheritance for the MDGs. The Millennium Development Goals contextualized in the development sphere how we were going to approach problems or what problems we were going to approach. Now, I think the downside of the MDGs was that it was very much structured on how the North or the West was going to help the South or the East. Now the goals that we're looking at are universal goals. They're goals for everyone, for people and for planets and for prosperity. So the new Sustainable Development Goals, which will be, I think they have been hammered out pretty well right now, and I think the member states will accede to those on the summit, which is coming up on the 25th through the 27th of September. For the ILO, we're very encouraged by the inclusion of decent work. Sustainable Development Goal 8 speaks to promoting sustained and inclusive, sustainable economic growth, as well as full productive employment and decent work for all. So by having that goal, it shows that at the center of Sustainable Development Goals is a rights-based, people-centered approach. And what that means is that without the environment, people can't survive, but also people need to derive from the environment. So how do we do that sustainably? How do we cut the forests and also make sure that that stewardship of the forests, we put more trees back in? How do we protect, the heritage of humankind, such as the Arctic and other natural areas, such as the oceans and protecting fish stocks? But when you're looking at decent work, you're looking at how everyone can actually move forward. So if someone has a good job that's fairly remunerated, that they have contributed to generating that wealth, that they should fairly share in that, they have a better health outcome. They can afford better health insurance. They could afford better education for their children. They can afford better diets for themselves and hence growing up healthy and having access to education. So we see decent work as central to the Sustainable Development Goals, which it is a monumental task, and it will require everyone's support, but it has to also change the minds of people around the world who are not involved in development policy and negotiations. Some will say, what do we care about sustainable cities? What do we really care about poverty? I'm not in poverty. But the problem is that poverty anywhere is a threat to prosperity everywhere. So we have to ensure that people have opportunities for themselves to grow, freely chosen. They're not forced to work. They're not trafficked back and forth and profiting just the sort of unscrupulous employers around the world. So how do you ensure that everyone plays their part? So with this, we have to look at a stakeholder model, not just a shareholder model, which we see in the business community, that it's about generating profits and enriching the shareholders who have contributed their money, and fair enough. But I think now we have to look at business as well as other sectors of the economy having to contribute to the wider sense of humanity. So through a business operation, if in fact you look at productive employment, then you're looking at higher level investments. You're investing more. Right now what we see is we see a lot of stock buybacks. We don't see actually investment in the future of the business itself. So things are kind of stagnating. There are some entrepreneurial people out there looking at apps, for example, and creating what they call the gig economy. Now, when you look at that, you realize that if in fact you have diminished the sort of employer-worker relationship, which had been standard for many, many decades, then you're not relying upon your employer for health benefits, for dental benefits, for a number of other sort of issues, and you're only contracted to do a little bit of work. So by getting just a small bit of work, you're never sure if you're going to be able to put that enough together to be able to send your child to school. So we're asking the businesses to relook at their business models as well too, because it is important for them to be profitable, but it's also important for the rest of society to know that they are benefiting from the wealth that they are generating themselves.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs, and also to perhaps make suggestions for future topics and future guests. Today we're taking a look at the world of work and how it is changing, and it's going to change even more dramatically in the future. My guest today is someone who's very familiar with this. My guest today is Mr. Kevin Cassidy. Mr. Kevin Cassidy is the Senior Economic and Social Development and External Relations Officer in the International Labor Organization Office for the United Nations. Kevin, we're talking about the world of work. When I was thinking about employment and unemployment, I think back to 2008 when we had the financial collapse, started in the United States, spread to Europe, and really reverberated around the world. Have we recovered from that yet? And what has it done as far as to create employment or unemployment, maybe we should say, opportunities for people? We don't want to say unemployment is an opportunity, but have we recovered from that? And how can we recover even more quickly, I guess?
Yeah, the financial and economic crisis has still, the ghost is still there. We still are feeling the impact upon that. From our numbers, we see that directly related to the financial economic crisis, that we lost 30 million jobs. Now, that loss of 30 million jobs, you add to that people who have dropped out of the labor market altogether. These are young people, which we call NEETs, neither in employment, education, or training, but also people who are of working age who have decided no longer to participate in the labor market, which means that they may be informally employed or unpaid family work and so. But of that number, we have a global jobs deficit of 61 million people. I mean, this is a huge number of people of wasted talent, people who are not at the world of work, who are not generating opportunities for themselves and for the rest of the society through their economic integration. We also look at the impact on demand. So what we've seen, and this has been happening for many decades, where productivity and wages usually were going in tandem, and that had been the trend for many, many decades. Around the 80s, that started to separate a bit, and some of it has to do with the globalization, hyper-globalization, and different means of production, and where companies are sort of outsourcing many of their aspects of their work. It also has to do with the introduction of technology. Now, we're not against that. We think that that is a natural progression in the world of work, but we have to look at how that impacts upon people. So what we have seen now is that by increasing the difference between the income and the productivity, that gap itself now is basically leaving lots of people with as little money as they were making back in 1979 in real dollars. So we are making less money today and even working harder. We're even more productive today. The loss in demand, I think this is what we're looking at. I mean, if people are not earning income, they don't have disposable income, and they can't buy goods and services. We see a $3.7 trillion aggregate demand gap. I mean, this is very serious numbers. So when people are not earning money or earning money commensurate with their productivity, they have to make do with less, which means that there's not the extra vacation. We're not buying that refrigerator. We're not sending so-and-so on to school, or we're going to stay with the old car. So, it's very, very important that the employers also understand that for other people to buy their goods and services, they have to have that income. And people have put their time and effort and energy. I mean, the amount of money that students are paying today for higher degrees is really almost bankrupting them. And we see with youth unemployment, this stands at, in most countries, 13 to 17%, in other countries even higher. So when you have young people who are being dissuaded from going into the world of work, what is the future of that country? So it's not just about the individual, it's about how that macroeconomic plan needs to be in place to ensure that education leads to employment, and that employment leads to progress, and that progress leads to higher levels of income, and that higher levels of income will generate more economic growth.
And you were talking about the income inequality gap, and years ago we used to look to Latin American countries for that. Today we look at the United States as having one of the widest income gaps in the world, perhaps. What can be done to reduce that? This is something that the market has not created in all probability, according to The Economist. What can be done to do that? Because you cannot have this widening gap with 1% having more and more of the pie, so to speak, and the other 99% having less and less. In order to have that consumer economy, you have to have people who are sort of middle socioeconomic types to buy these products, to be productive members of society, and to have sufficient income. But what can we do to change that?
Yeah, there are a number of ways, I think, to approach this. Let's look at it from a very practical point of view. For example, climate change, the environment. We know that climate change is happening. The science is there. We know that this is going to impact upon jobs. When sea levels rise and land is reclaimed by the sea, that is land that is lost to farmers. That is land that is lost to fishermen. That is land that is lost to economic opportunity. How do we provide and mitigate against that? There's going to be a transition. We know there is going to be. So how do we train people more in engineering, or we're training them in renewable energies and so? So I think there are ways in which we could look at some of these problems as opportunities for better paid jobs. If you are a solar engineer, if you are a software data modeler looking at the impact upon sea rises or hotter summers on crops and so, it's going to create new and dynamic sectors in the industry, and so that's one way of looking at it. The other way, I think, is also looking at, as I said earlier, about businesses looking more at the stakeholder model. I mean, in the old days, in the United States, you would have the company town that would pay for everything. Now, we're not looking for a return to that, but I think what was very important back then was that companies realized that they did more than just make profits. They were driving the economies in certain areas. They wanted brand loyalty, and people would buy from them. So I think we have to go back to the point of starting to realize that this is not just an input that I'm putting onto my ledger sheet, but these are people that I'm investing in. These are the societies in which I'm deriving my employees of tomorrow. I have to ensure that the people that are working for me are committed to me, because that's where productivity goes up. And by productivity going up, that means that the profits are increasing as well too. There are a number of polls out there that say that 80% of people dislike their jobs. I think if people were shown dignity in the workplace, if people were respected in the workplace, and they were paid fairly for what they did, you would have greater loyalty, you would have greater profits, and you would have greater opportunities for people to move forward. So I think that there are a number of ways to address this problem. Social protection, as we mentioned before, about reskilling and educating people, active labor market policies, looking at minimum wages. I think there's a number of ways that we can put this in place.
You mentioned minimum wage, and that's one area that has not kept up over the years. The minimum wage hadn't been raised for, I think, back in the 70s or something. I may be wrong on that, in the United States. How important is that, especially for maybe the fast food industry or industries that are going to be in the United States, to have a decent living wage for the people who are employed there?
Yeah, it's it is a very difficult debate, because some businesses work on razor-thin margins, and I think the food industry is one of those. But we've taken it for granted for too long that the customer will provide the tip to supplement the income. Well, I mean, if you're creating a business, you're not relying upon others to pay your workers fairly so that you can actually make your profit. So will that mean that some businesses will go out of work? Well, unfortunately, that'll probably be the case. But it's with every destructive idea, you have the construct on the other side. So you have new businesses that are getting out there that can be more productive, and so businesses that are working just by the profit margin, trying to keep their price point below a certain decision-making level. I think people are flexible with that. I think when people start to look at the benefit that is coming to society, I think that they would be more willing to pay a little extra for that. But it's not really just on the part of the workers. We can't shift all the cost onto the consumers and to the workers. I think business has to take a hard look at themselves as well too, and say, are we contributing towards this, or are we making the problems worse for ourselves? I think a lot of it comes out of this fact that now people's investment horizons are very short, that they're looking for large gains on a very short period of time. We always want the best for ourselves, but I think the reality is that we may want a Mercedes-Benz, but if we have a Volkswagen budget, we have to be realistic about that. So let's look at what we have. Let's look at how people who are working for us, who are loyal to us, who are bringing innovation into the company itself, that we should fairly remunerate them. And it's not just for the people at the top level, because what you then is you create not only just the income gap, but you also have a societal gap. And I think a lot of the CEOs and some of the luxury brand manufacturers are now looking at this, I mean, from an enlightened, self-interested point of view, and saying who is going to be buying our goods, but also the social unrest that comes about with unemployment. I think the Arab Spring, which is now for many people probably an old example, but when society starts to drag down, when people don't have income, when people don't have opportunities for themselves, when they lose their house, when they lose their job, they lose the dignity, they lose a sense of self-worth for themselves, that spills over into the social sphere and then into the political sphere. People get angry about that. So we want to ensure that the society moves forward as well too, and that the economics are fair. It doesn't mean that you can't make extraordinary gains in profitability. I think that's not what we're looking at. But we're looking, how do people fairly share that wealth has been developed? The person on the line making the tire is doing a lot more for that company brand, or the person in the marketing department is doing a lot more for that brand than maybe the unknown movings of the CEOs and the C-suite executives. So there are a lot of different moves I think we need to look at and different operations.
Exactly right. And of course, this is a very complex area, and we see that the traditional workforce is changing. We see that the traditional business model is changing. We see that there are many challenges that we have in this society and every other society. But Kevin Cassidy with the United Nations International Labor Organization, thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. I am Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.